At 68, Peggy sat in the heavy silence of the office and watched 40 years of devotion vanish with a stroke of a pen. The grand mansion and the millions were signed away to her late husband's children. For Peggy, there was only a brown envelope. Inside sat a single oxidized key and an address for a house in the middle of nowhere. Stephen, Catherine and Michael didn't bother to hide their smirks. They were certain they had finally discarded her, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back. They thought her life was over. They didn't understand that being stripped of everything is sometimes the only way a woman can find her own worth. That rusty key wasn't an ending, it was a foundation. The mansion, the bank accounts, the vast investments, the children took it all. While they traded Victoria's looks, already spending money they hadn't earned, Peggy held the rest. A piece of iron and a handwritten note for a small town no one had heard of. The attorney looked at her with a pity he couldn't quite mask as he handed her the envelope. Peggy left the home she had tended for decades with one suitcase and a wedding photo that no one else wanted. She carried the weight of a profound humiliation, discarded by the family she had tried to build. But the heirs were too young and too greedy to see the truth. Greed blinds you. They kept the money that runs dry and the house that eventually decays. Peggy, however, held the key to a secret empire that Richard had protected in silence for 40 years. He had been waiting for this exact moment. He was waiting for the day she would need to know she was truly loved. If you have ever felt the world wrote you off because of your age, if you have been discarded by those who should have protected you, this story is for you. Welcome to Dreams Don't Age. Subscribe now, because what Peggy found when that key turned in the lock will prove that divine justice never gets the address wrong. Peggy Ann Morrison was 28 when she married Richard, a powerful attorney 17 years her senior. It was 1984. Peggy had been his secretary, the quiet, efficient woman who kept his life in order without ever asking for credit. Richard was a commanding presence, a man who owned every room he entered. When he asked her to dinner, she was stunned. When he proposed, she said yes, believing she had finally found safety. But Richard's children had made their stance clear from the start. Stephen was 20, fueled by a sharp anger. Catherine was 18, cold and calculating even then. Michael was 16, resentful and confused. To them, Peggy was just the secretary who had tricked their father. Catherine told her at the wedding reception, her voice sweet but her eyes like ice. But Peggy did try. For 40 years she tried. She memorized their birthdays. She attended every graduation. She sent gifts that were never acknowledged, trying to find a place in a heart that was already close to her. She spent 40 years turning a house into a sanctuary for people who didn't want her there. She hosted every holiday. She cooked elaborate meals. She kept childhood bedrooms perfectly preserved for stepchildren who only visited to judge her. Peggy bit her tongue through every cutting remark about her background. Her community college degree was a joke to them. Her inability to give Richard more children was treated like a personal defect. Through it all, she believed she was building a real marriage. She managed the Brookline mansion with the precision of a clock. It was a cold colonial house Richard owned long before she arrived. She played the gracious hostess for his colleagues. She made everyone comfortable. She never drew attention to herself. For 4 decades, she was faithful and devoted. Richard was kind to her in his own distant way. He provided clothes for social events. He never raised his voice. But there was always a wall between them. He kept a part of himself strictly separate. He traveled for weeks at a time for work. His home office remained a fortress she was never allowed to enter. "I need one space that is just mine, Peggy," he said. She should understand that. He kept bank accounts she never saw. When she asked about finances early on, he simply patted her hand. He smiled at her like she was a child asking adult questions. "Don't worry your pretty head about money, darling." He told her that was his job. Her job was to make the house a home. Peggy trusted him. You trust the person you pledge your life to. She didn't even question the solo weekend trips. Once a month, he went to decompress at a property he inherited. Peggy packed his bags. She kissed him goodbye. She lived on a foundation of sand and called it solid ground. Richard Morrison died on a Tuesday morning in March. He was 3 months away from his 85th birthday. Peggy found him during their morning ritual. She brought his coffee at 7 a.m. sharp. He died in his sleep, a massive heart attack. The doctor said there was no suffering. Peggy stood there with a steaming cup in her hand. She felt a strange disconnect. Beneath the shock, something else flickered. It felt almost like relief. She pushed the thought away instantly. The funeral was a massive affair. Richard had been one of the top attorneys in Boston for 50 years. Half the city came to pay their respects. Hundreds of colleagues and judges filled the church. Stephen, Catherine, and Michael sat in the front row. They presented a perfect image of a united family. They placed Peggy in the second row. Stephen offered a tight, empty smile. He told her it was for space. He said it was in case her own family needed to sit with her. But Peggy had no family. Her parents were long gone. She was an only child. 40 years as Richard's wife had burnt every bridge to her old life. She sat alone in the second row, a ghost at her own husband's funeral. The second row, that was her assigned place. It was a silent public declaration that she was a guest, not a widow. A footnote in a life she had shared for 40 years. One by one, colleagues stood to praise Richard Morrison. They spoke of the legal giant. They wept for the pillar of the community and the devoted father. But Richard the husband was never mentioned. It was as if Peggy had spent 4 decades invisible, a shadow standing behind a man everyone else claimed to own. At the reception in Stephen's expensive home, the air felt even thinner. Peggy stood near the catering table, watching the __quote_2___ mourners. She heard Catherine's voice, sharp and clear. __quote_3___, she said, dabbing at eyes that remained perfectly dry. Those words cut deeper than the grief. The real family. As if 40 years of Peggy's life had been nothing more than a long rehearsal for a part she was never allowed to play. The reading of the will was set for 7 days later. Peggy drove to the downtown Boston office of Marcus Chen with trembling hands. She dressed with the quiet dignity of a woman who still believed in loyalty. A simple black dress, white hair styled exactly as Richard had always preferred. She told herself there was no reason for the hollow feeling in her stomach. 40 years of marriage had to mean something. Surely, after a lifetime of service and devotion, he had ensured she would be safe. Stephen, Catherine, and Michael arrived like a small army. They had expensive cars and even more expensive lawyers trailing in their wake. They offered Peggy polite, guarded nods before taking their seats on one side of the conference table. A united front. Peggy sat on the other side, alone. Marcus Chen began with the cold formalities of the law. Testamentary capacity, proper execution. Words that felt like stones being laid between them. Then came the numbers. The estate was valued at approximately $8.7 million. The primary residence in Brookline was worth $2.1 million. There were investment and retirement accounts totaling another $6 million. Peggy felt a brief, fluttering sense of relief. $8.7 million. It was a fortress. She imagined Richard had kept these secrets to surprise her, to ensure her old age would be spent in peace. Then Marcus's voice turned flat, clinical. The Brookline house, he read, was left in its entirety to the children, Stephen, Catherine, and Micah, to be sold or divided as they saw fit. A cold chill began to crawl up Peggy's spine. The house she had called home for 40 years was no longer hers. The investment accounts, totaling $4.22 million, were also divided equally among the three children. The cold spread through her chest, making every breath a struggle. The retirement accounts, valued at $1.8 million, followed the same path. Everything went to the children. Peggy's voice was barely a whisper. __quote _5 ___. Marcus looked pained. This was a man who had sat at their dinner table for decades. He had laughed at Richard's jokes and praised Peggy's cooking. Now he couldn't meet her eyes. He whispered that he had fought against the language in the document. He had begged Richard to reconsider. But Richard had been cold. Richard had been certain. Marcus took a jagged breath and began to read the words of the man Peggy thought she knew. The will stated that Peggy Ann Morrison had lived comfortably at Richard's expense for 40 years. It claimed she had wanted for nothing. The document described her life as a benefit of his wealth and his social standing. It compared her marriage to a lifestyle she never could have earned as a simple secretary. Then came the phrase that stopped her heart. Richard wrote that his estate was adequate compensation for her companionship. He called their 40 years together domestic services. Each syllable felt like a physical strike to her chest. Devotion, sacrifice, love. All of it was reduced to the fine print of a service contract. Peggy felt the floor beneath her begin to slide. Across the table, Stephen's mask finally dropped. He was smiling. Catherine was looking at her nails with a bored, practiced indifference. Michael didn't even look up. He was texting, likely already spending the money he hadn't earned. Marcus continued, his voice heavy with a regret he couldn't hide. The will moved to the core of the betrayal. Richard believed his only real responsibility was to his children, to his bloodline, to the Morrison name. Peggy was an outsider who had served her time. For her, there was only one thing: a property at 47 Oakwood Lane in Millbrook. It came with the contents inside and a cold ultimatum. Peggy had 30 days. 30 days to pack up her entire life and vacate the Brookline residence. The heirs needed the house. The __quote _8 heirs wanted their prize. The silence in the room was absolute. Only the faint, rhythmic clicking of Michael's phone broke the air. Peggy sat like a statue. She couldn't breathe. 40 years of her life had been dismissed as an expired contract. She was being given a minimal severance package and shown the door. Catherine broke the silence with a voice that was sharp and fake. She mentioned that her father had spoken of the Millbrook place years ago. She described it as a ruin in the middle of nowhere, a house not even worth the trouble of a sale. The taxes were probably higher than the value of the land. She looked at Peggy with a hollow kind of pity. She told her at least she'd have a roof over her head. Stephen stood up. He was done with the emotions and ready for the business. He wanted to discuss the timeline. He spoke about the strong market in Brookline. He talked about staging the house and listing it immediately. He wanted her out as soon as possible. Marcus cut him off with a voice of pure steel. He reminded them that the law was clear. Peggy had 30 full days to find a new life. That was non-negotiable. Stephen smiled smoothly and agreed. He claimed they weren't unreasonable people. He just didn't see a woman anymore. He saw an obstacle. Peggy now had exactly 30 days to erase 40 years of her life. Take your full 30 days, Peggy. We understand this is a transition for you. Marcus Chen slid a brown envelope across the polished surface of the conference table, his hand trembling with a guilt he couldn't quite hide. Inside lay the deed to a property in Millbrook, now transferred to her name. Beside it sat an iron key, old and heavy and coated in rust, the kind of object that looked like it belonged to a museum or a different century. Finally, There was a single sheet of Richard's expensive stationery, covered in the precise, familiar handwriting she had known for decades. 47 Oakwood Lane, Millbrook, Massachusetts. Peggy, this is yours now. Go there as soon as you can. The words on the page felt like a whispered secret from beyond the grave. You'll understand everything once you arrive. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you before, but they were always watching, always listening, always looking for ways to challenge anything I tried to do. Trust me one last time, my darling. All my love always, Richard. Trust him? She tried to reconcile those words with the public betrayal she had just endured. The legal documents that labeled her nothing more than adequately compensated domestic help, leaving her essentially homeless, with nothing but an unknown property in a town she had never heard of. Peggy's legs felt like they were made of glass. She gripped the brown envelope and walked toward the door. She didn't look at Stephen. She didn't look at Catherine or Michael. She didn't say a word. Marcus called out, his voice thin and reaching. She didn't turn back. She simply nodded and kept walking until she reached her car in the parking garage. In the dim silence of a 10-year-old Honda Civic, the dam finally broke. She sat in the driver's seat and sobbed until her lungs burned and she had nothing left inside. What followed was a masterclass in calculated cruelty. For the next 30 days, Stephen, Catherine, and Michael turned the Brookline house into a theater of entitlement. They arrived nearly every morning with contractors and interior designers in tow. They carried measuring tapes and color swatches through rooms where Peggy had lived, loved, and labored for a lifetime. They discussed knocking down walls. They planned to rip out the kitchen where she had prepared thousands of family meals. They spoke of modernizing the gardens she had spent 40 years cultivating with her own 2 hands. They never asked her to move. They never asked her to leave a room. They simply acted as if she were already gone. A ghost haunting a house that no longer belonged to her. One morning, Peggy sat in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. Catherine walked in with a designer, her eyes passing right over Peggy as if she were a piece of old wallpaper. __quote _12 Catherine said, gesturing toward walls that were still covered in Peggy's carefully curated family photos. __quote _13 Peggy said nothing. She only reached into her pocket and gripped the rusty iron key until it bit into her palm. A few days later, the same indifference repeated itself. A real estate agent stood 3 feet from Peggy's chair while she tried to read in the living room. The agent and Stephen discussed staging strategies and comparable property values as if Peggy were just a piece of furniture that came with a sale. __quote _14 the agent noted, peering through the window at the beds Peggy had planted and maintained for 40 years. Those were Peggy's gardens. Every rose bush she had planted, every perennial she had carefully chosen, every vision she had nurtured with her own 2 hands, it was all just an obstacle now. Overgrown weeds standing in the way of a profitable sale. The nights were when the real terror arrived. Peggy would lie in the master bedroom, a space she no longer owned. Stephen had graciously allowed her to remain there, but only because the furniture needed to stay in place for the staging. She was a prop in her own life. Her mind would spiral into the dark. She was 68 years old. She had no job, no career, and no experience that meant a thing to the modern world. The last time she had pulled a paycheck was 1984, 40 years ago. She had been a secretary then. Now she was a ghost. Who would hire a shadow? What could she possibly offer? The Millbrook property was a joke, just as Catherine had said. Worthless. If she was lucky, incredibly lucky, she might scrape $50,000 or $60,000 from it. That could buy her 3 or 4 years of survival if she counted every penny and ignored every need. And after that? The thought was a dead end. 72 years old and destitute, dependent on the cold hand of government charity. A small, cramped room in a facility for the elderly poor. Some nights, the fear was a physical weight on her chest. She couldn't breathe. Her heart would race like a trapped animal. She would get up and pace the dark bedroom, her hands shaking, as her mind painted vivid pictures of homelessness and absolute despair. Then, the fear would shift. It would turn into a rage so hot it burned her throat. How dare Richard do this? How dare he let her spend 40 years believing they were partners? She had built a life with him. She thought she was secure, but in death he revealed the truth. She was never a wife. She was just the help. He had chosen them. He chose his entitled, selfish children over the woman who had devoted her entire adult life to his comfort. But rage takes energy, and Peggy was running dry. Being terrified and angry at the same time is exhausting. Eventually, she just went numb. She moved through the house like a machine, packing up a life that had been built on a foundation of lies. She packed 3 suitcases of clothes. Most of what she owned went into the trash. What was the point of keeping it? These were the clothes Richard wanted her to wear. This was a persona he had bought for her. She kept 2 boxes of the things that were actually hers, old photographs of her parents, a picture of the girl she used to be before she disappeared into this marriage. Letters from her mother, a few books from her grandmother's shelf. That was it. 40 years of existence reduced to 3 bags and 2 boxes. On day 28, Peggy was at the kitchen sink when the voices drifted in from the dining room. Stephen and Catherine were talking. They didn't care if she heard. Perhaps they wanted her to. "I honestly cannot believe Father left her anything at all," Catherine said, her voice sharp and clear. "That Millbrook property is probably worth $50,000 at most. He should have left her absolutely nothing. He just felt guilty." Stephen's voice was a shrug. 40 years is a long time to string someone along, even if she was essentially just the help, he replied. The Millbrook place was his way of easing his conscience, without actually reducing what we got. Well, she should be grateful we're being so civilized about this transition. Catherine didn't miss a beat. Chapter 21. They actually laughed. It was the casual, effortless cruelty of people who had never spent a single night wondering if they'd have a roof over their heads. Peggy stood at the kitchen sink, her fingers gripping the porcelain until her knuckles turned bone white. A scream was building in her chest. She wanted to shatter the silence. She wanted to march into that dining room and tear down their smug entitlement and their complete lack of human decency. But she stayed still. 40 years of training had taught her to swallow her own voice. She was the gracious woman, the one who avoided scenes. Even now, after they had stripped her of everything, the cage of her own politeness held her fast. On her final morning, Peggy walked through the house one last time. She expected to be crushed by the weight of 40 years of memories. Instead, she felt a hollow silence. The master bedroom, where she had slept beside Richard for 4 decades, was just a room. 4 walls, a window, furniture that had never truly belonged to her. The guest rooms were shrines to stepchildren who only visited when it was unavoidable. The obedience that had kept her quiet for a lifetime was staying behind in those empty spaces. The living room was a stage where she had played hostess to people who barely looked at her. The kitchen was a factory where she had prepared thousands of meals that were eaten without thanks. The only thing that hurt was the garden. She stood among the roses she had planted during that first hopeful spring. She looked at the herb garden she had built with love and the perennial beds she had designed to bloom in a perfect seasonal dance. This was the only place in 40 years where she had left a mark. Now it would belong to strangers who would never know the woman who had coaxed life from the dirt. At 10 in the morning, Peggy loaded her car. 3 suitcases, 2 boxes. She took the wedding photo from the mantel, ignoring the memory of Stephen's protest that it was technically house property. Stephen arrived at 1:30, early, of course. He wanted to make sure she was actually leaving. He said, refusing to meet her gaze. "Peggy," said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight she didn't know she possessed. "Do you have any idea what it's like? To give 40 years of your life to a family and then be told those years were worth nothing?" Stephen's face flushed a deep, angry red. "Father left you a property. You aren't getting nothing." "Your father left me a mystery," Peggy replied. "A house I've never seen in a town I've never heard of. You and your siblings got millions of dollars and this mansion. You got the legacy. I got a rusty key and 30 days to disappear from the only home I've known for 40 years. So no, Stephen, I don't think you have any concept of what this is like." She climbed into her car before he could respond. She needed to leave before the numbness cracked. The brown envelope sat on the passenger seat next to her purse. The GPS showed the address she had entered: 47 Oakwood Lane, Millbrook, Massachusetts. 2 hours and 14 minutes toward a life she could not yet imagine. She turned the key and left the Brooklyn mansion behind. She left the ghosts of the life she thought she had earned. As she drove west into Massachusetts toward Millbrook, Peggy Ann Morrison made herself a solemn vow. At 68 years old, she owned nothing but her name and her dignity. Whether 47 Oakwood Lane with a sanctuary or a pile of rubble, she would find a way to stand. There is a strange, quiet power in having nothing left to lose. It is a peculiar kind of freedom. Millbrook was exactly what the world expected of a place left behind. Small, rural, still. 15 structures stood around a town square that felt frozen in time. A general store with a tired, faded awning. A diner with curtains like a checkerboard. A tiny post office and a gas station with 2 lonely pumps. The library looked like it had been standing since the 1800s. As she crawled down Main Street, the town seemed to stop. People didn't stare with cold suspicion. They looked with something that felt like recognition. It was as if they had been waiting for her to appear. An old man sweeping the sidewalk paused to offer a silent wave. A woman arranging flowers at the diner nodded, as if confirming a long-held truth. Even the teenagers by the library looked up from their screens with genuine curiosity. The GPS guided her off the pavement onto the dirt of Oakwood Lane. For 200 yards it was a road. Then it became a path into the deep forest. Massive oaks lined the way, their trunks wider than her car. Their branches wove a canopy of green that swallowed the afternoon light, casting dancing patterns across her windshield. The ground was rough and rutted. Her low sedan groaned over the uneven earth as she moved deeper into the shade. After what felt like a lifetime, the mechanical voice announced her arrival. Peggy killed the engine and sat in the sudden silence. She was terrified to look. She was afraid Catherine had been right, afraid she would find nothing but a skeleton of a house and a pile of broken dreams. She took one breath, then another. She lifted her eyes and finally stared at her future. The property was nothing like the ruin Catherine had described. The house stood in a wide clearing, guarded by those ancient oaks like silent sentinels. It was built of grey fieldstone, solid and defiant, dating back to the 1800s. The 2-story structure was imposing. The slate roof looked remarkably intact. White wooden trim framed the leaded glass windows, and a heavy oak door waited under a carved stone portico. Thick ivy climbed the weathered stone walls. It didn't look like the rot of neglect. It looked like a choice. like a piece of a forgotten English estate preserved in amber. Peggy traced the skeleton of what had once been a formal garden. Grass fought to bury the old stone paths. Wild roses grew untamed, their thorns sharp and thick. What used to be a kitchen garden was now a riot of herbs and wildflowers. In the center stood a stone fountain. It was silent and dry, but it remained elegant. This was a secret world. Time had tried to reclaim it, but the beauty refused to break. She sat in her car, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then she heard it. Footsteps on the dirt road. A woman walked toward her from the direction of Millbrook. She was in her mid-70s, but she moved with a surprising steady purpose. She wore a modest cotton house dress and carried a wicker basket. "You're Peggy," the woman said. There was no hesitation. She knew. Peggy climbed out of the car. Her knees felt like water. "How did you know?" "We've been waiting for you," the stranger replied. It was too simple. Too calm. "Richard told us you'd find your way here eventually, after he passed. He said to watch for a woman named Peggy in an older Honda. I'm Dorothy Harmon. I run the general store in town." She held out the basket. It was heavy with bread, eggs, milk and coffee. "I figured you'd need the basics. The house is maintained, but the cupboards are bare." Peggy took the basket. Her fingers brushed the wicker. Her mind was a storm. "Richard told you?" "He never said a word. Not once, not in 40 years of marriage." Dorothy's eyes softened. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a heavy kind of pity. "Richard was here every month, dear, for 40 years. He cared for this land himself. He patched the roof, he tended the grounds. He told us that when he died, his wife would inherit it all." Peggy felt the world tilt. "He kept it a secret. Why?" "For your protection," Dorothy said gently. "Protection from what?" "From them, I imagine," Dorothy replied. "The ones who took everything else. His children from the first marriage. Richard knew they never accepted you. He knew they'd find a legal loophole to claim this place if they found out. So he kept it hidden. From everyone. Even you. He waited until his death would make the inheritance final. He made it unchangeable by any court." Dorothy turned and gestured toward the house. "Come, let's get you settled." She didn't reach for a key. Richard rarely locked the doors. He believed the people of Millbrook were honest. He believed if someone needed a roof, they should have it. That was the man he was in this place. Peggy followed Dorothy up the stone path toward the front door. Her head spun with the weight of it. 40 years. Richard had lived a second life. Once a month. Every month. Every weekend trip he'd claimed was for work, or for the children, or for his own solitude, had been a lie. Or perhaps it was the only truth he had. He had been coming here, to a house he never mentioned, to an entire existence kept in the dark. Dorothy produced a heavy iron key from the envelope. It was etched with rust, yet it turned in the lock with a silent, fluid grace. The massive oak door drifted open without a single protest from its hinges. Dorothy stepped back, her voice barely a murmur in the cool air. She said. Peggy crossed the threshold and felt the very foundation of her world shift. It was as if the tectonic plates of her life were grinding into a new, unrecognizable shape. The interior was not the ruin she expected. It wasn't abandoned or rotting. It was breathtaking. The main floor breathed with open space. Wide wooden planks glowed with the deep patina of a century of polish. A stone fireplace, anchored by a mantel carved from a single limb of oak, commanded the room. The furniture was understated but exquisite. A leather sofa, softened by years of use, sat in the center. Chairs were positioned exactly where the afternoon light hit best. Shelves groaned under the weight of leather-bound stories. Hand-woven rugs hushed her footsteps. Through the leaded glass windows, the forest light fractured into dancing patterns across the floor. But it was the walls that stopped her heart. Every inch of vertical space, every shelf, every flat surface was occupied by frames. They were all of her. Peggy on their wedding day, luminous and draped in hope. Peggy in the Brookline garden, her knees in the dirt and her face lit by a joy she had long since forgotten. There she was laughing at a joke she couldn't remember. There she was reading, the sun catching the silver in her hair. There she was sleeping on a cabin porch, captured in a moment of absolute peace. 4 decades of her life were preserved here. Different ages, different seasons. Hundreds of unguarded moments curated into a private museum where she was the only masterpiece. "He loved you beyond measure," Dorothy said from the shadows. "Anyone who stepped inside this house knew that instantly. This was his shrine to you. This was the only place Richard could truly be himself, away from the performance of his life in Boston." The tears Peggy had been holding since the funeral finally came. She hadn't cried when the earth hit his casket. She hadn't cried when the attorneys tried to erase her from his will. She had been too numb, too terrified of the silence. But here, surrounded by the physical proof that she had been seen, she finally broke. Dorothy didn't move. She let the silence hold Peggy's grief for a long time. Eventually, she guided the widow to the leather sofa. Dorothy whispered. She led Peggy through the rooms with the practiced ease of a caretaker. The kitchen was a marriage of eras. An antique wood stove stood beside modern steel. Copper pots hung from the ceiling. A deep farmhouse sink sat beneath shelves of beautiful, unfamiliar dishes that looked as though they were waiting for a meal to begin. The dining room held a massive oak table built for 12. The dust suggested no such crowd ever gathered there. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms sat simple and still. In the master suite, another hearth waited. Windows looked deep into the pines, but it was the walls that stopped her breath. Peggy was everywhere. Dozens of frames hung there. These were images she never knew existed. Stolen glimpses of her hanging laundry, laughing at something unseen, just living her life. Richard had been watching. He had been truly seeing her for decades. Dorothy's voice cut through the silence as they descended. "This house has been maintained for years by a fund Richard built. He made a pact with a local bank. Utilities, taxes, every repair. It is all paid for. For the next 50 years, Peggy, you will never have to worry about these expenses. You will never worry about a roof over your head." "But why?" Peggy's voice cracked. It was the sound of a woman who had been discarded too long. "Why hide this for 40 years? Why let me believe I was a footnote while his children took the world?" "Because of them," Dorothy answered softly. She led Peggy toward a hidden door beneath the stairs. Richard knew Stephen, Catherine, and Michael. He knew they would scent this property like wolves. They would have used every legal trick to claim it. They would call it a marital asset. They would demand their share of the estate. This place isn't just wood and stone, Peggy. It is what it holds. Richard protected it by making it invisible. He waited until the law could no longer touch him. The door opened to a windowless room, 10 feet by 12, a fortress of records. 3 walls disappeared behind floor-to-ceiling shelves. They were stacked with binders and document boxes. Every one was meticulously labeled in Richard's sharp hand. On the 4th wall sat a mahogany desk. A green banker's lamp waited there. A leather chair bore the ghost of a man who had sat there 1,000 times. In the very center lay a thick, cream-colored envelope. "My beloved Peggy," the script said. It was his hand. Dorothy whispered, "This is what he really wanted you to find. This is why he built the sanctuary." Peggy reached for it. Her fingers trembled so violently, the heavy paper rattled. It was expensive stock, sealed with thick red wax. It felt like a relic from a century of honor. She broke the seal. Inside were 5 pages. They were dense with the handwriting of the man she thought had forgotten her. "My dearest, most beloved Peggy," it began. The sight of those words brought the tears back. "If you are reading this, I am gone, and you found the sanctuary. I am profoundly sorry it came to this. I am sorry I couldn't share this peace with you while I lived. I couldn't let you understand what I was doing. But Stephen, Catherine, and Michael were always waiting. They were watching for any crack in my armor. They wanted to claim what they felt was theirs. Had they known of this place, they would have found ways to take it. 50 years in the law taught me one thing. Attorneys are experts at finding loopholes. I know this because I was one of them. So I hid the truth. For 4 decades I shielded it, nurtured it, and kept it in the shadows for you. This house came to me in June of 1984. I inherited it from my uncle, Thomas Morrison, only 3 months after our wedding day. Thomas was a quiet man, a historian who lived with a simple heart despite his vast wealth. He left me this land with a single command written into his will. Save this place for the person you love more than life itself. He believed this roof should shelter devotion, not gluttony. For 40 years, Peggy, I have been keeping it safe for you. I know what my public will said. I know how those cold words must have stung as you sat in Marcus Chen's office. Hearing yourself described as nothing more than well-paid domestic help is a wound I never wanted to inflict. But you must understand the necessity. I chose those words with a sharp, calculated purpose. I knew Stephen, Catherine, and Michael would dissect every sentence, hunting for a reason to strip everything away from you. I gave them exactly what their vanity craved. I gave them the visible wealth and the hollow assets they could flaunt to their friends. I handed them the Brookline mansion. What they don't realize is that the property is mortgaged to the hilt. Between the property taxes, the maintenance, and the strict historical preservation traps I wove into the deed years ago, that house will drain them. I placed their investment accounts inside complex trusts. To touch a cent, they must hold steady jobs and pass annual character reviews. I gave them exactly enough rope to believe they had won, while they unknowingly tie their own financial knots. But for you, my dearest Peggy, I reserved everything that carries true weight. This house sits on 247 acres of protected forest. When I had the property appraised last year, the land alone was valued at $3.2 million. Conservation groups are already desperate to buy it, though the choice to stay or sell belongs only to you. The structure itself is worth another $800,000 as a historical landmark. Yet, beyond the money, I have given you the one thing they can never touch: freedom. The trust fund I built will handle every cost: the utilities, the taxes, the repairs, and the insurance for the next 50 years. You will never have to worry about the price of your own roof. You will never have to fear the bank. The deed is in your name alone. It has been since 1984. I established it as a gift entirely separate from our marriage, making it legally untouchable by any predator, as my own attorneys will prove if anyone dares to challenge you. There's one more thing. The filing cabinets in this study hold 40 years of my life's work. They contain the documented secrets of powerful families and influential figures who believed their skeletons were buried forever. I never touched this information. My ethics would not allow it. But I kept it all organized and filed because I knew that information is the ultimate insurance. If Stephen, Catherine, or Michael ever discover the sanctuary and try to contest your ownership, you have the means to stop them. If they ever try to claim you manipulated an old man, you have the power to protect yourself. The files labeled with their names contain the truth of their own financial dealings and private lives. These are things they would pay any price to keep hidden from the world. Use this knowledge only if you must, Peggy, but keep it close. Know that even now you are not alone. Finally, and most importantly, every single photograph in this house was taken with love. Every moment I spent within these walls was spent thinking of you, missing you, and wishing I could bring you here. But I knew I couldn't risk your safety until my own death made everything secure. You were the best part of my life, Peggy. You were the only pure, good and real thing in a life that was otherwise a performance of obligation and maintaining appearances. I'm sorry I was too much of a coward to stand up to the judgment of my children. I am sorry I prioritized a false peace over publicly defending the woman I loved. I made you feel second best when you were always first in my heart. I failed you in life by being weak. I can only hope I have succeeded in death by being clever. This sanctuary is yours now. Live in it, sell it, or transform it into whatever you wish, but know that it was created from love, protected by love, and given to you with more love than I ever managed to express while I was still breathing. You deserved someone braver than me. You deserved a man strong enough to choose you over the fear of conflict. But I gave you what I could. This place, this protection, and this proof that you were cherished, even when I was too weak to show it to the world. Forever and always yours, Richard. Peggy read the letter 3 times, her tears blurring the ink as each reading revealed new layers of a man she thought she knew. When she finally looked up, Dorothy was still there, standing quietly in the doorway like a patient sentinel. Dorothy spoke softly, noting that he was a complicated man. Flawed, certainly, weak in some ways, but his love for Peggy was never complicated. That was the one thing he was absolutely certain about. Peggy carefully folded the paper and set it back on the desk. Then she turned to the filing cabinets Dorothy had pointed out. She opened the top drawer of the first cabinet and found exactly what Richard had described. There were property deeds showing her sole ownership since 1984. There were financial documents detailing a trust fund and legal papers confirming every word he had written. The second cabinet contained far more sensitive material. Folders were labeled with the names of prominent Boston families. It was a library of documentation, deals, arrangements, and secrets that powerful people thought were buried forever. The third cabinet made Peggy catch her breath. A thick folder sat inside, labeled Stephen Morrison, Catherine Morrison Grant, and Michael Morrison. It contained trust documents and personal records. She pulled it out with shaking hands and sat at Richard's desk to read. What she found was devastating in its thoroughness and brilliant in its execution. The trusts Richard had established for his children were not simple inheritances. They were elaborate, time-release structures with strict conditions designed to make accessing the money nearly impossible. Stephen's $2,800,000 in investment accounts could only be accessed in $100,000 annual increments. This was only if he maintained continuous employment verified by tax returns and passed annual character evaluations conducted by an independent trustee. Richard had appointed a retired judge for this task, a man known for taking ethics extremely seriously. Catherine's trust had similar restrictions, including a requirement that she maintain stable family relationships. Given her history of 3 divorces and the estranged relationships with her own children, this was a condition she would find nearly impossible to satisfy. Michael's inheritance was a cage made of fine print. He was handed a business trust that demanded his constant daily labor. If he stopped managing the investments for even a moment, they would dissolve. Every cent would go to charity. Then there was the Brooklyn mansion. The heirs had been salivating over that property for years. But Richard had wrapped it in layers of historic preservation laws. Selling it would require years of committee meetings and environmental studies. To make matters worse, the house was drowning in debt. Richard had taken out a massive loan just 2 years prior. Now, his children were responsible for the payments. They had received exactly what they wanted, and it would make them utterly miserable. Peggy sat in Richard's old chair and did something she hadn't done in years. She laughed. The sound bubbled up from a place her grief couldn't reach. After months of humiliation and the cold fear of being discarded, she finally saw the truth. She sat in the quiet study of her secret home and laughed until her sides ached. Dorothy joined her. They both understood the brilliant, patient, perfectly legal trap Richard had set. The first 2 weeks in Millbrook passed in a silent daze. Peggy walked through the rooms like a woman waking from a nightmare. The house was a fortress of peace. Everything was already handled. The lights, the water, the heat, all were paid for by a trust Richard had built for her. Outside, the November wind began to bite. Inside, Peggy was wrapped in warmth. The pantry was stocked with enough food to last through the winter. Dorothy came by every day with fresh supplies and introductions to the neighbors. Each person she met held a piece of a man Peggy never truly knew. Pastor James spoke of a new church roof paid for in total silence. He wasn't allowed to put up a plaque or say thank you. Mrs. Pedersen told her about a grandson who became the first in their family to graduate college. Richard had paid the entire tuition through an anonymous scholarship. Sarah, the town librarian, described 5,000 books that arrived just as the library was about to close. In Boston, Richard had been the man his children expected. In Millbrook, he was the man he chose to be. Generous, kind, tangible. Quote, 49, Dorothy said one evening. They sat on the clean stone porch, the air crisp and still. Dorothy sipped her tea and looked at her friend. Richard had asked about the house every time he visited the store. He wanted to know if it was suitable. He wanted to know if it was enough for his Peggy. He had shown Dorothy photos. He had told her stories. He had spent years preparing a world where Peggy would never be invisible again. Richard had once told her she was the only person who saw the man behind the bank account. He said protecting her from his children was the hardest mission of his life. 2 weeks after Peggy arrived in Millbrook, the silence was broken by a call from Marcus Chen. He told her she needed to be ready. Stephen had already retained a legal team to contest the will. Peggy felt a strange, cold calm settle over her. Quote 50 she asked. Her voice did not shake. Stephen was claiming the Millbrook estate was a marital asset. He argued that Richard had intentionally hidden its true value. He wanted a court to force a sale and split every cent among the siblings. Peggy looked toward the heavy filing cabinets in Richard's study. They were packed with decades of proof. Quote 51 she said. This property was deeded to her as a gift in 1984. It was hers long before it could ever be considered a shared asset. Richard had planned for this day with surgical precision. Marcus let out a breath of approval. He had helped Richard lay those legal stones himself, but he warned her that Stephen's lawyers were aggressive. Peggy didn't blink. She had survived 40 years of their cruelty. She could handle a few more. 3 days later, a silver Mercedes appeared on the dirt road leading to the sanctuary. Stephen was behind the wheel. Catherine and Michael were beside him. Peggy watched them from an upstairs window. As they stepped out, their faces shifted from smug confidence to stunned silence. They looked at the pristine stone walls and the sprawling, cared-for grounds. They realized the true value of what they had tried to throw away. Peggy waited until they knocked before she descended the stairs. She opened the door with a steady hand. "Hello, Stephen, Catherine, Michael. Would you like to come in?" They followed her into the foyer. Peggy watched their eyes dart towards the craftsmanship and the fine furniture. Every wall was covered with photos of her life. She let the silence stretch until it became heavy. "Please, sit in the living room," she said. "I will make tea." She served them using delicate china that once belonged to Richard's uncle Thomas. She was gracious and entirely in control. They had come expecting to find a woman broken by grief and poverty. Instead, They found a woman who radiated a quiet, untouchable power. Stephen cleared his throat, his eyes shifting around the room. Peggy, we've come to discuss the house. We believe there's been a misunderstanding regarding the will. Peggy took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea. A misunderstanding? Do explain. Catherine leaned forward, her voice sharpening with envy. Father clearly didn't understand what this land was worth when he gave it to you. She looked at the architectural details with hunger. This property is worth a fortune. As his primary heirs, we have a legal right to a share of all significant assets. This property is not a marital asset, Peggy said. Her voice was as cold and steady as stone. It was deeded to me in 1984, a gift from your father, separate from our marriage. I have every document to prove it. Michael finally spoke. We don't believe that is legally binding. Any gift of this value given during a marriage is joint property. It should be divided. Peggy looked at him with a gaze that did not waver. Then I suppose you will have to take me to court, she said simply. But before you make that choice, there is something you must see. She walked to the study and returned with a heavy folder. It bore their names in her late husband's precise hand. She laid it on the coffee table like a weapon. __quote _64 __. She leaned forward, her presence filling the room. Quote 65. Stephen's face turned the color of ash. Quote 66, he whispered. Quote 67, Peggy replied. Quote 68. Peggy turned her eyes toward Michael. She stood up. The meeting was over. Her voice dropped an octave, heavy with warning. The room fell into a heavy silence. The only sound was the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. Stephen, Catherine and Michael looked at each other. Then they looked at Peggy. They were truly seeing her for the first time in 40 years. She wasn't the quiet secretary who had married their father. She wasn't the domestic help who had served their meals. She was a woman with power. She was a woman with ammunition. And she had the will to use it. Stephen finally said, his voice was tight. Peggy said graciously, "Your father loved you in his own twisted, complicated way. I'm sure of that. But he loved me more. He simply lacked the courage to show it to the world until he was finally gone." The siblings left without another word. Their expensive Mercedes bounced awkwardly down the dirt road, looking fragile and out of place against the raw landscape. Peggy stood on the porch and watched the dust settle. She went inside and sat in Richard's favorite chair by the window. For the first time since the funeral, she cried. These weren't tears of grief or the sharp sting of betrayal. They were tears of pure, cooling relief. The weight was finally gone. 6 months passed. Peggy sat on her restored stone porch, watching the Millbrook forest catch fire with the reds and golds of autumn. The seasons had turned, and she had turned with them. Stephen, Catherine and Michael had vanished from her life. They dropped their legal challenge only a week after that final visit to the house. Marcus Chen handled the closing paperwork, sealing Richard's will forever. The siblings eventually sold the Brookline mansion, but the victory was hollow. After 5 months on the market, they realized the truth. Richard had left them a cage of debt, historical requirements and legal fees. They walked away with far less than they ever expected. His revenge was quiet, perfectly legal, and absolutely devastating. During those months, Peggy stopped living in a museum. She transformed the sanctuary from Richard's shrine into her own home. She hired local hands to help her breathe life back into the gardens. Now the fountain runs with clear water. The stone paths are straight and steady underfoot. Roses bloom in order. Herbs grow in thick, fragrant rows. She updated the kitchen, keeping its soul but making it functional for her. She cleared the walls. She kept the photos of herself but added art that spoke to her own spirit. The bookshelves were no longer for show. They were filled with stories she actually wanted to read. She chose furniture for her own comfort, ignoring the cold aesthetics of her old Boston life. But the real change happened in the heart of Millbrook. Peggy was no longer an invisible shadow. She found herself welcomed in ways 40 years of high society had never offered. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she is at the library. On Wednesdays, she helps at the community center. Every Sunday, she sits in the same pew at the small white church. People greet her by name. They are genuinely glad she is there. For the first time, Peggy has real friends. Dorothy Harmon has become the sister she never had. The younger people in town seek her out for advice. Children wave to her on Main Street. She belongs. And that belonging has nothing to do with whose name she carries. One afternoon, Peggy found one last envelope in the back of Richard's study. It was labeled, "For Peggy's Future, open when you're ready." Inside was a deed in her name, paid in full. 20 acres on the edge of town, complete with a small barn and a cottage. There was also documentation of a trust fund for $500,000. It wasn't a gift for her to sit idle. It was established specifically for whatever projects or purposes Peggy Morrison chooses to pursue in her new life. At Morrison House, she finally has the tools to build exactly what she desires. The ink on the page was Richard's, familiar and steady. It didn't offer apologies. It offered a command. Build, create, transform. He called this place a blank canvas, a chance to finally pick up the brush after 40 years of holding his palette. Peggy wiped her eyes, the salt stinging her cheeks. She didn't need time to think. She already knew the first stroke. She would build a harbor, not just a house, but a sanctuary for the others, the women who had poured themselves out until they were empty, the widows who woke up to a silence that screamed, the once fleeing shadows looking for a place to breathe. She would call it Morrison House. It was Richard's final gift, but she would be the one to breathe life into its lungs. The sky over the ancient oaks bruised into deep purples and oranges as the sun dipped low. Peggy watched the light fade and felt the weight of the journey. She remembered the will reading, the cold, clinical erasure of her entire existence. The sheer bone-deep terror of being 68 and possessing nothing but her own breath. She saw Richard clearly now, without the haze of grief. He wasn't a hero. He was a man of silences and compromises, a man who often chose his own peace over her protection. He had been weak when she needed him to be iron. Yet, in his own complicated way, he had been working. He had spent 4 decades weaving a safety net out of shadows. He gave her a ruin so she could find her own strength in the stones. He gave her freedom disguised as abandonment. He handed her power wrapped in the packaging of worthlessness. He gambled that she was wise enough to see the sanctuary beneath the dust. At 68, she was no longer the secretary, no longer the accommodating wife or the ghost of a stepmother. Peggy Ann Morrison, 68 years old. She had spent 40 years being a mirror for everyone else's needs. She had been the woman who never made waves, the woman who demanded nothing. But the mirror was broken now. Beneath the rolls, something new was breathing. To her own delight, she realized she wasn't finishing a book. She was writing the first sentence of a brand new story. Thank you for walking this path beside her, from the humiliation of that office to the triumph of these woods, from being invisible to becoming invaluable. If Peggy's story touched a place inside you that feels forgotten, if you have ever been erased by those who should have cherished you, you are not alone. If you have discovered that your ending was actually a beginning, leave just one word in the comments. Describe the moment you realized you were stronger than they ever imagined. Peggy is the proof we all need. Genuine love creates a legacy that greed can never touch, no matter how hard it tries. Sometimes, the sharpest edges of a cruel will hide a secret grace. Justice may be slow, but it never forgets the way to the right door. You are never too old to claim the life you were meant to have. Share this with a soul who feels invisible. Remind them that their worth is not defined by those who discarded them. It is defined by the love that chose to protect them, even from the silence of the grave. Together we prove that dreams don't age. Strength has no expiration date. The greatest treasures are often those kept safe from greedy eyes. Welcome to our family of warriors. We are the ones who bloom beautifully in our own perfect time.